Good day, everybody. We're going to be looking at a broad overview of the tax incentive for learnerships. Now, this falls under the Income Tax Act number 58 of 1962 and it's section 12H. The tax incentive for learnership agreements was introduced in the form of an allowance, which may be deducted from the employer's income from trade when the employer's tax income is determined. The allowance is referred to in this guide as the learnership allowance and is applicable to registered learnership agreements and contracts of apprenticeships entered into or completed during a year of assessment. A deduction of the learnership allowance constitutes a deduction in addition to other income tax deductions allowable to employers for the employment and skills development of employees. That is, the expenditure incurred on their salaries and/or wages and skills development. Tax relief is granted to employers that enter into registered learnership agreements with persons that were not employed with them when the learnership agreements were entered into, as well as their existing employees. The allowable deduction will, however, be greater where the registered learnership is entered into with a person that was not employed by the employer. An employer will, furthermore, qualify for a greater deduction where a registered learnership agreement was entered into with a disabled person. So what is a learnership agreement? A learnership is a work-based approach to learning and gaining qualifications. The Skills Development Act of 1998 sets out the criteria of a learnership as follows. It must consist of a structured learning component. It must include a structured work experience component. It must lead to a qualification registered by the South African Qualifications Authority associated with a trade, occupation, or profession, and it must be registered with the Director General of the Department of Labour in a prescribed manner. Now, learnerships include traditional apprenticeships registered with the Department of Labour in terms of the Manpower Act of 1981, and a learnership agreement is an agreement entered into for a specific and specified period between a learner, an employer or a group of employers, and a skills development provider accredited with the Quality Council for Trades and Occupations. And the agreement must be in a prescribed form and manner and registered with a SETA in the prescribed way. So the terms of the learnership agreement must oblige the employer to employ the learner for a period specified in the agreement, provide the learner with specified practical work experience, and release the learner to attend the education and training specified. It must also oblige the learner to work for the employer and attend the specified education and training. And it obliges the skills development provider to provide education and training specified in the agreement and the learner with support specified in the agreement. Let's discuss now the learnership allowance. There are requirements that must be met in order for an employer to qualify for the allowance. Any employer will be eligible for a deduction of a learnership allowance during a year of assessment if the requirements are met. Number one, a learnership agreement must have been entered into or completed during the year of assessment. The learnership allowance is deductible in the year of assessment during which the learnership agreement has been entered into and the learner, which is party to the learnership agreement, has completed the course. Where a learning agreement is entered into and is completed during the same year assessment, the employer will qualify for a deduction in both respects. Now, a learnership agreement is considered to be completed when confirmation is provided by the SETA with which the learnership agreement is registered, and the learnership has been successfully completed according to its required standards or the standards of the professional body. A contract of apprenticeship is considered to be completed if the terms prescribed in the Manpower Training Act of 1981 have been met and the apprentice or learner has successfully completed a trade test to the satisfactory completion of the necessary professional body. The learnership agreement must be a registered learnership An employer will only qualify for a deduction of a learnership allowance if a registered learnership agreement has been entered into with the learner. SETA, SETA, is defined in Section 12H to mean a sector, education and training authority established in terms of the Skills Development Act of 1998. An employer that entered into a learnership agreement with a learner which has not been registered with the SETA or which does not constitute a contract of apprenticeship registered with the Department of Labour will therefore not be entitled to claim the learnership allowance for such learnership agreement, as the learning agreement does not constitute a registered agreement as defined. The learnership agreement must have been entered into within a specific and specified period. The employer must be the original employer in terms of the learnership agreement, and an employer is defined as the following. In the case where a group of employers is party to a registered learnership agreement, the employer which has identified that agreement as the lead employer, or in any other case, the employer which is party to a registered learnership agreement. We're going to look now at a number of factors which must be taken into account in calculating the learnership allowance. The amount of the deduction which will be allowed for a registered learnership agreement during a year of assessment will depend upon various factors. Number 1, whether the learnership agreement was entered into or completed. Number 2, the date on which the learnership agreement was entered into. 3, whether the learnership agreement was entered into for less than 12 months or more than 12 months. 4, whether the learner was already in the employment of the employer at the time of entering into that learnership or was not in the employment of the employer at the time. Next, in respect of learnership agreements entered into on or after the 1st of July 2006, whether the learner is a disabled person or not, and whether the learnership agreement is a registered contract of apprenticeship. So a disabled person, as defined in Section 12H, is to mean a person who falls within the definition of people with disabilities as contained in Section 1 of the Employment of Equity Act. A disabled person is therefore a person who has a long-term or recurring physical or mental impairment which substantially limits their prospects of entry into or advancement in employment. So, the quantum of the annual allowance. The annual allowance is deductible in each year of assessment in which the learnership agreement is in force. For 12 months during any year of assessment, the quantum of the annual allowance is equal to 40,000 Rand for a learner holding an NQF level qualification from 1 to 6. Or 20,000 Rand for a learner holding an NQF qualification from 7 to 10. If the learner is a person with a disability, 60,000 Rand for a learner holding an NQF level qualification from 1 to 6, and 50,000 Rand for a learner holding the qualification from level 7 to 10. The pro rata portion is calculated in the same ratio as the number of full months that the learner is a party to the agreement during the year of assessment. The completion allowance. The completion allowance is granted once off in addition to the annual allowance and is deductible in the year of assessment in which the learner successfully completes their learnership. The South African Revenue Services requires sufficient proof of the successful completion of the learnership agreement in order to allow the completion allowance under Section 12H. Now, normally, confirmation from the relevant SETA is accepted by SARS to be confirmation of successful completion, and many employers, however, are having difficulty in obtaining confirmation from the SETAs in the year of assessment. In view of these difficulties, SARS will consider alternative proof. Any objective evidence as proof of successful completion will be accepted, for example, a statement of results issued by an accredited training provider and an evaluation report by a registered assessor on workplace experience. A specific list of what is considered to be objective evidence cannot be provided, and each case will be determined on its own merits. Besides the objective evidence of successful completion, the employer must also satisfy SARS that reasonable steps were taken to request confirmation of completion from the relevant SETA. Let's have a look now at learnership agreements which are equal to or exceeding 24 full months. The quantum of the completion allowance is equal to 40,000 Rand for a learner holding an NQF level qualification from 1 to 6, multiplied by the number of consecutive 12-month periods within the duration of that learnership agreement. It is 20,000 Rand for a learner holding an NQF level qualification from 7 to 10, multiplied by the number of consecutive 12-month periods. Now, if a learner is a person with a disability, then it's 60,000 Rand multiplied by the number of consecutive 12-month periods, or 50,000 Rand multiplied by the number of consecutive 12-month periods. Termination of a learnership agreement. If a registered learnership agreement is terminated, the employer will be able to deduct an amount equal to a pro rata portion of the annual allowance in that year. The employer is not entitled to deduct any further annual allowances or the completion allowance since the learnership agreement is terminated and the learnership is not complete. Under Section 12H, Part 8, for each year of assessment during which an employer is eligible for an annual or completion allowance, the employer must submit to the SETA with which the learnership agreement is registered any information relating to that learnership agreement required by the SETA in the form and manner and at the place and time indicated by the relevant SETA. So under Section 12H number 7, any SETA with which a learnership agreement has been registered under the Skills Development Act must submit to the Minister any information relating to that learnership agreement required by the Minister in the form and manner and at the place and time that the Minister prescribes. Let's consider now an example. ABC Pty Limited has a 31st of March year end. Now, they concluded learnership agreements with employees X, Y, and Z and employee D, who is a person with a disability, pursuant to a trade carried out by ABC. The learnership agreements with these learners have been registered with the relevant SETA, and titles and codes have been allocated and issued by the Director General, Department of Labour. Now, we assume that the current provisions of Section 12H remain unchanged for the duration of the learnership. So let's have a look. Employee X has an NQF Level 6 qualification and entered into a 12-month learnership on the 1st of October 2016. Now, the learnership agreement was registered with the SETA only on the 1st of December 2016, and the learnership was completed successfully on the 30th of September 2017. Employee Y, with an NQF Level 7 qualification, entered into an 18-month learnership on the 1st of October. On the 15th of February 2017, he left the employer of ABC without transferring the learnership to a new employer under the Skills Development Act. Employee Z, with an NQF Level 7 qualification, entered into a 12-month learnership agreement on the 1st of January. At the end of the 12-month period, Z failed his learnership and immediately entered into a new learnership with ABC, which according to the SETA had the same education and training component as the 12-month learnership, but instead extended over a 2-year period. And then finally, employee D, the person with a disability, has an NQF Level 6, entered into an 18-month learnership agreement on the 1st of October 2016, and on the 31st of March 2018 successfully completed their learnership. Firstly, employee X. An annual allowance of 20,000 Rand, which is 40,000 times 6 divided by 12, is deductible because the learner is a party to a registered learnership agreement with the employer for only 6 months. Section 1282C deems registration of the learnerships to occur on the date of commencement of the learnership, provided it is registered within 12 months after the last day of the employer's year of assessment. And the year of assessment ending 31st of March An annual allowance of 20,000 Rand is deductible because the learner is party to the registered learnership. Secondly, a completion allowance of 40,000 Rand is deductible since the learnership agreement is for less than 24 full months.